Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Jewish Theological Seminary. My name is Bert Visotsky, and I'm the director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue here. I will immediately turn over the podium because we are co-sponsoring this evening with the Nelson Mandela Center at the Museum for African Art. And I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Zahidu Mohammed, to come give words of greeting.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. It's been a very interesting and exciting collaboration for us at the Nelson Mandela Center at the Museum for African Art. And I would like to thank Bert and the Milstein Center, as well as Joshua Stanton, for allowing us to have this exciting collaboration this evening, and our esteemed panel. So let's give them a warm round of applause. Thank you. I'm going to introduce Joshua. He's going to be our moderator this evening, and then Josh will introduce our panelists. We'd also just like to let you know that the intention this evening is to have an interactive evening. We would like to have your thoughts and ideas and engage our panelists. I think that is their preference as well. So Joshua is nearing the completion of his rabbinical studies at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where he received his master's in Hebrew literature in 2012 and is studying as a Schusterman Rabbinical Fellow. In addition to serving as a rabbinical intern, he's presently focusing his energies as a student on State of Formation, which engages approximately 150 emerging religious and ethical leaders across the country and prepares them for effective intra- and inter-religious leadership in America's singularly diverse religious landscape. Joshua is also the Associate Director of the Center for Global Judaism at Hebrew College and Director of Communications for the Coexist Foundation. He is founding co-editor of the Journal of Interreligious Dialogue and co-director of Religious Freedom USA, which works to ensure that freedom of religion is protected in practice as it is in theory. Josh co-edits O.N. Scripture, the Torah, a weekly online Torah commentary featured on the Huffington Post. Thank you, Josh.
Just before I turn the floor over to Josh, first of all, I should add, in his spare time, he likes to knit and cook. We do want to have an interactive evening, and let me just explain the order of the evening because the panelists will say a few words after Josh introduces them, and then Josh, as our moderator, he's our token young person, millennial, will engage them in some dialogue. But each of you should have received an index card when you came in and a golf pencil. That is not for you to record your scores, but it is to give you the opportunity, if at any point in the statements or in Josh's dialogue, that you have questions. When Josh is done dialoguing, the ushers will come and collect your questions, and we'll be able to sort through them so that we can ask them directly, and that way group them together and get to as many people as possible. The other thing, this is the Jewish Theological Seminary. We have a Muslim, we have a Christian, we have a Jew, and therefore there must be ritual. Please turn off your electronic devices.
So we're here right now at a very exciting time, and for a number of different reasons, but in my mind, no more than because we're finally starting to learn about the millennial generation. All sorts of research is coming out about us. All sorts of questions are being asked. And the initial responses and initial findings are fascinating. First of all, it looks like we're going to eclipse the boomer generation as the largest in American history. Perhaps 80 or 90 million of us are going to be coming of age in the next 10 or 20 years. They describe our cohort as those born since 1980 and perhaps arguably to the present, although we'll leave it to demographers to figure out. And the key finding that is of interest today, in my mind, is that we don't perceive the world in terms of a generation gap. We are a generation that loves our parents and loves our grandparents. We're a generation that, according to every finding, cares deeply about social justice, but doesn't want to break the mold, doesn't want to entirely recast what our parents set out before us, but rather carry on the baton into the future. So we're very privileged this evening to be here with three social justice visionaries of the boomer generation who can help lead and guide and inform our work as future leaders and really show us what might be next for social justice in the United States. Our three panelists are Dr. Aziza Al-Hebri, who is Professor Emerita at T.C. Williams Law School at the University of Richmond and the founding director of Karama, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, which is based out of the United States but impacts so many issues around the world, promoting human rights and particularly the rights of Muslim women under Islamic law. Next to her, we have the Reverend Julie Johnson Staples. Her career has brought her far and wide, from the private sector to journalism, and then just right around the corner here to Riverside Church, where her focus is on education. She is a member of quite a few associations, but just to pick one or two to highlight, she is a member of the NACCC National Ambassador Team, and she acts as a regional advisor to ministerial search committees and a resource representative for members of churches across the movement. Next to her is Rabbi David Saperstein, who is director and counsel for the Religious Action Center, which is the social justice arm of the Reform movement of Judaism. Rabbi Saperstein in 2009 was named the most influential rabbi in the country and has also been described in the Washington Post as, quote, the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill. We're very privileged to have all three with us today, and we begin with 5-minute statements and openings from each of them, sharing a little bit about their paths and the issues that spark their interest. So I invite Dr. Al-Hebri to start us off.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to this wonderful place, which I visited for the first time over 20 years ago. I guess that dates me, but that's how long my friendship with Rabbi Vysotsky has lasted and will continue. So thank you very much for inviting me again. I'd like to talk to you today from the heart about the things that have crossed my mind and that I've been concerned about. So I'd like to start by talking about Muslims, my own faith group. So despite the presence of Muslims in the U.S. for centuries now, and very few people realize that Muslims have been here since about the 1400s, real recognition and dialogue with us as an American faith, not a foreign one, did not take place until relatively recently. And even that dialogue, which I think I remember with Rabbi Saperstein, we were also very involved in the 90s, even that has been occasionally challenged by events. I think major amongst them is 9/11, as you might imagine, which caused a little bit of a relapse in these efforts. At the same time, I might mention some relapse, but at the same time, there were a lot of interfaith organizations who came to the fore and actually took their position in an attempt to protect the Muslim faith and people from unfair reactions. So I should recognize that. But taking some of that away and looking at the longer historical picture, what has stood in the way of our dialogue in the past has been centuries of Orientalist literature, which depicted Muslims in various ways that you might be familiar with, and also global politics, which at heart were economic in terms of their interest, and also included racial stereotypes, as opposed to spiritual values of justice and compassion, of how to deal with each other. So there were structural challenges to a healthy dialogue among us over the centuries. And if you go back and look at some of the Orientalist literature, you'll understand what I mean. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but also economic interest by nations that have also created a hostility that had historical bearing. At the same time, many immigrant Muslims were new to a religiously diverse society. Not every Muslim came from a country where they lived with Christians and Jews, as I did. Some came from countries that were quite homogeneous. And suddenly they found themselves transplanted into a society where they had to deal with people they like, people they can relate to, but who had a different faith. How do you do that? They had no idea how to negotiate these relationships. And now they know, thanks to the interfaith relations and dialogue over the decades. Also, many of us, Muslims, came from highly religiously diverse societies, like I did, that have worked together effortlessly for centuries. I have a history in my family of interfaith dialogue. This is nothing new. We have correspondences with religious leaders discussing matters of religion that are of interest to all of us. We brought our skills of interfaith dialogue to the table, and hopefully those skills also helped accelerate and advance the interfaith experience in this country. Because to some extent, I somehow feel that the interfaith dialogue itself in this country is relatively new. And that it really needed all the help it could get to move forward on healthy footing. Over the last 2 decades, what we learned as religious communities is that we are not different. As humans, we have the same needs, aspirations, fears, and concerns, even though those might have different historical justifications. As spiritual beings, we learned that, again, we are not that different, and that this earth yearns to social justice regardless of the source. It doesn't matter when somebody is suffering injustice where that help is coming from. So here are some of the things that in the past we have done together in the last couple of decades. Our interfaith community fed the poor, sheltered the abused, and helped the helpless regardless of their faith or the lack of it. That is something important. We didn't say Muslims will help Muslims, Jews will help Jews, and Catholics will help Catholics. We opened our doors to everybody. So despite our diverse faiths, our communities had remarkably similar problems, and we had to solve them, and we engaged in similar solutions. Second, our interfaith community educated in churches, mosques, and synagogues about the other, because really that's how we appeared to each other a few decades ago. Each one of us was the other to the other, right? And so we opened our places of worship so that the other could come in and talk to all of us. We even opened the doors of these institutions to a variety of speakers, visitors, and so on. And by doing that, we were able to at least partially demystify this other. You know, you had your stereotypes, we had our stereotypes, but when you face a human being, somehow those stereotypes dissolve. So we established a sounder basis for cooperation, which is based on human interest and common spiritual values. We're not that different spiritually. We might act like we are, we might want to think that we are, but let's look at it. We share a lot more than that which divides us. Thirdly, we learned from each other's experiences and thoughts, and that might surprise you, so let me talk a little bit about it. I came to this country in the 60s, right at the time when the feminist movement developed, and I became very active in it. And I listened to the Christian and Jewish feminists who were revisiting their religious literature and developing interpretations of their sacred text, which says that God is not a guy, is not a male, is not a patriarch. Now, you might think that that was just interesting, especially since I was not a person of faith at that time. But the long-term effect was a lot more than that, because a lot of what I do today and what my organization Karama does is to reinterpret sacred text. Go back to the roots. Find out what our sacred texts really said, not what patriarchal interpreters might have told us it said. And by that, I have been influenced by the thoughts of those before me in the feminist movement. So we all teach each other. This is one word. We also at Karama have a program which is called Law and Leadership. And in that program, we get women from all over the world once a year. And we teach them how to be good leaders and how to understand their faith. So whatever I am believing and whatever interpretations I am developing is also finding its way and resonance across the globe. It's no longer limited to one place or one country. Fourthly, we built together the interfaith movement coalitions that were important to all of us. We circled our wagons to protect one of us who might have been treated unfairly. Well, a recent example of this, as you all know, is what happened in the metro station in New York City. And who jumped to defend the Muslims? The non-Muslims, the interfaith community, right? And they underwrote the expense and made their voices be heard. The same thing is happening now in Florida with the anti-Sharia legislation, something we can also talk about, and which is another type of problem that the Muslim community has been unfortunately subjected to. And the fifth thing I'd like to point out to you is that in time, with our thoughts and actions, we really helped create a modern American, and I would add global youth, given my experience at Karama, which is not bound by the conflicts of the old world, and which is hopeful about reshaping a more equitable and a less conflicted new world. Question is, will they succeed? And I hope that they will, and that they will relay the message to the next generation as well. My concern is this. How deep are these changes that interfaith dialogue has brought about? Will these changes withstand the trials of time? My own judgment is that these changes were at first neither very deep nor immune to challenges, but they've been getting deeper roots, just as we keep doing what we are doing. Nevertheless, unless we work further on them for the next generation or two, they can be reversed. And we need to know that so that we don't get too complacent. So to do that, we need more than interfaith dialogue that goes back to the roots of our social divisions and conflicts. We need to go back critically to the basic principles of our religions and ask ourselves some questions. A, whether we fully understand the basics of our religion. B, whether as believers we truly subscribe to them, or we just mouth it. These are not easy questions. Once we go back to these issues, we can ask ourselves, must we really have torture in this world? Or explosives or drone attacks that kill babies? Or children in prisons with their mothers? What would Moses, Jesus, or Muhammad say about all this? You say you're an interfaith community. Let's be serious. Which is better from the lens of our faith, war or diplomacy? Are we off the hook if secular governments make the decision for us? They go to war instead of us? Or if we have a legal system that separates faith and state, church and state? Does that mean we have to be silent on certain issues? Or does it mean that we can bring our faith into the public square, like everyone else of faith or no faith, and argue our case? What does it mean? We have become experts. I'm being very frank, right? All of us recognize ourselves in this. We've all become experts at dodging difficult questions, finding excuses as to why we cannot do today what the sacred documents told us to do in ancient times. We argue that today things are different. Yes, they are. And they will remain different until we decide to change them. There's a verse in the Quran which says, God will not change the condition of a people unless they change their condition. That kind of change, each interfaith group has to make its own. But we can remind and support each other in seeing it happen. I cannot do for you what you can do about the spiritual awakening in your own religion in terms of its basic values, and you cannot do that for me. But we certainly can push each other and support each other to get there. We can engage in activities in this world that build happiness, not misery. Well, we've had some attempts in our history, the Peace Corps program as envisioned by President Kennedy, or the Gates Foundation project in Africa with President Carter, which was designed to eliminate diseases. Yes, they might bring dividends to our country. Some people may be concerned that that dividend is not totally unpolitical, but we need to engage in such projects even when doing so does not benefit us in any way. This is particularly our field of volunteerism. Otherwise, we would be missing the essence of volunteerism, of sharing, giving, and recognizing that humans have a God-given dignity that they all deserve to have protected and nurtured, even if they inhabit the farthest, poorest corner of this earth. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Josh and Zahida for inviting me to this panel, and especially to Rabbi Bert, who also is my former professor. I'm happy to say I studied here at JTS, so I'm thankful to be back here tonight. In thinking about my brief opening remarks, because I really do want to have us get into this together, I was reminded of a passage in the 4th chapter of the book of Kohelet, also Ecclesiastes. And it is this: 2 are better than 1 because they have good return for their labor. Now, Bert is laughing because he knows that I came to seminary leaving a career on Wall Street, so he's probably like, any way I can get a good return on investment into the discussion is probably what I would try and do. But what I mean by that is in the interreligious, interfaith context, okay? I descend from a family where justice has been at the forefront for generations. My grandfather was a field rep for the NAACP in Missouri and actually worked the nation's most horrifying lynching in Sikeston, Missouri, and took my father there to sort of put him in a never forget kind of mindset. My mother led the Iowa delegation to the March on Washington, and then came me. And what did I do? I don't know. I thank God right now I'm at the Riverside Church in the city of New York, and I thank my fellow congregants and my Hebrew student also, who is back in the back row, for coming. But I worked as a journalist for 20 years doing what? Seeking justice, trying to get that story out. And there was plenty to tell. Even when I came along, and yes, I think I was already identified as being in the boomer generation, so certainly that places me sometime as being born in the 1950s, which is correct. But then beyond that, seeing journalism not really quite doing it, I went to law school. Why people are litigating for their rights. Not quite doing it still, and throughout that period, maintaining a deep faith in my God, which we share, the God of Abraham, figuring out how can we find justice. So you asked the question to motivate our conversation tonight, what issues spark my interest? How do you live justice? How do you teach justice? I'm the interim minister for education at the Riverside Church, which has a long tradition of speaking out for peace and justice. Martin Luther King gave his speech against the position of continued U.S. involvement in Vietnam at the Riverside Church. But how do we move forward from there? How do we engage yet another generation? Those are the issues that motivate me and make me want to continue to do the work, no longer as a journalist, no longer working in law, but working in a religious community, trying to bring together people across barriers. And that's going back to the Kohelet idea, because you have good return for your labor when there's more than one at the table. Okay, and just real briefly, my second question for us tonight is, how do we keep Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream alive across races, across religions, and across generations? Okay, that's really the test. Because we need to figure out how, if we can, in our lifetimes, to end the barriers that separate us from the other, however that other gets defined. So that's my opening remarks. Please, I look forward to your questions.
I, too, want to just express my appreciation that all of you are here to engage in a conversation with us and that this extraordinary program was put together. Here's Zahida Mohammed having been called to initiate a new institution named for one of the true giants, humanity's true giants for justice, is itself an eloquent statement as to her capabilities. And Bert Wazowski is one of the great public intellectuals of American Jewish life, teaching at one of American Jewry's greatest academic institutions. And this is kind of a who's who of things. Aziza Al-Hebri and I have worked together for over 2 decades here, a formidable presence in Muslim legal circles and a key advocate in interfaith coalitions for religious freedom and human rights. And Reverend Staples has already had a successful careers making real impact in 2 different fields. And the fact that, having just completed a study, she's been called to grace one of America's greatest religious institutions and most influential churches speaks volumes here. And I love Josh Stanton. He is a 1 year out of rabbinic school, a rising star in the American rabbinate with an enormous reputation already. So I could just stop here to tell you I'm thrilled to be with my my colleagues here. I'm going to tackle this from a slightly different way. I want to convey the urgency that I feel about the work that the interfaith community is capable of doing, with the consequences of the failures to act at this particular moment in history, this extraordinary crossroads. We live at a time in which technology has made the consequences of bad decisions more dangerous and perilous than humanity has ever known. I'm absolutely convinced that every generation thinks that the problems that they face are more perilous and more dangerous than every generation before them. And the only difference between us today and the generations before is they were wrong and we're right. And it is technology that has created that dynamic. We've always had the ravages of warfare and the moral challenges of deciding when the use of force may be justified, but never have we faced military technologies that, if misused, could destroy the entire world as we know it. We've always faced the threat of pollution to our water and air. And each of our religious traditions cherishes the responsibility that we have to protect God's creation, which has been entrusted to our stewardship and our care, but not when matched with the prospects of global warming, ozone depletion, ravaged rainforests, escalating eradication of whole species of life, rapidly increasing population, which together threaten to alter the very climate of the entire globe itself. We've always had intrusions into our freedoms and our privacy, repression of free speech, persecution of our religious lives, but not when matched with the technology that can make Orwell's nightmare of 1984 the reality of the world. We have always had the challenge of applying new technologies in an ethical and moral manner, but not when matched with the genetic engineering that allows us to create entire new forms of life and alter human life itself. In the next few years, we will simply decide the path that humanity will follow in addressing these momentous issues and so many more. We will use our wisdom, knowledge, and technologies to help nations resolve their differences peacefully or blow up the world in a nuclear holocaust. We use it to clean up the damage done to our environment, preserve the creation God has entrusted to our care, protect it for generations yet unborn, or despoil, contaminate it. We use it to enhance those freedoms so essential to allowing people to find spiritual fulfillment, or degrade or diminish them. We learn to share God's wealth equitably and fairly with all God's children, or to deny justice to the 2 billion of our brothers and sisters living on the edge of malnutrition and starvation, ignoring the warning of the Talmud 2,000 years ago that the sword enters the world because of justice delayed and justice denied. We'll use our knowledge in genetic engineering to cure birth defects or create Hitler's master race. Look, in the lifetimes of some in this room, we have smashed the atom, cracked the genetic code, pierced the veil of outer space itself. And as Father Brian Harris pointed out, in a world in which you can do anything, what you should do, the moral question, is a fundamental challenge facing humanity. And on that question, the religious communities have urgent, profound, and indispensable wisdom to offer. You look back over this last century, and it's hard to think of any of the great achievements in America, in American history, that came without the religious community working together to create the moral filter through which this country saw it. Whether we're talking about the right to organize and the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the Great Society programs, the efforts to expand the rights of women, the efforts to protect God's creation and the environmental movement. In each, the religious community has made enormous contributions to those efforts. On a global level, just think about the impact after decades of academics telling us how dysfunctional was the debt system that was burdening the international community in the poorest countries across the globe. It was a Jubilee campaign in which the ideas of the Bible about the Jubilee year and the forgiveness of debt were lifted up to become the filter through which so much of the world saw that effort that we helped achieve the enormous changes in what happened there. High percentages of healthcare and education across the globe happened because of the efforts of the religious community. We've made an extraordinary difference, but we are needed more than ever right now. There are daunting challenges we face, yet at the same time we live at a time of hope, which our ancestors, our prophets, our sages throughout the ages, our parents could only have dreamed of. For we are the first generation that produces enough food to feed every human being on earth. A failure to do so now is a failure of moral vision and political will, and on that the religious community can have enormous influence. We're the first generation that can conquer malaria and an array of diseases that have plagued humanity from time immemorial. A failure to do it is a failure of moral vision and political will. We are the first generation that can educate every child on earth, undo the damage to the environment, spread freedom across the globe. In all these, our failure to do it is a failure of moral vision and political will. And it is the religious community that has historically been and can be today the moral goad to the conscience of the world. And in all of these issues, what I have learned clearly in my 35 years of moral and religious advocacy to the government and society is that on all these issues and more, someone will decide. And our only choice is whether we will be the audience watching others make those decisions, or we will be the authors of those decisions. And this I tell you, if we remain silent, in the vacuum of our silence will come voices that do not share our values, our dreams, and our aspirations. Voices not of charity and justice, but selfishness and greed. Voices not of love, but of hatred. Voices not of respect and tolerance, but of secular and religious extremism and intolerance. Look, this is the first generation in all of human history that does not have the luxury to make the same mistakes as those before us and learn from them. It is as though all of human history was a dry run for this moment, and this time it counts. It's not a new idea. Just across the street in the church that you serve, Dr. King said in his remarkable Vietnam speech, we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written those pathetic words, too late. For God's sake, for the sake of our children, we must not be too late. And it is this sense of urgency that must animate the work of religious communities across the globe. Never before has our world needed more to hear clearly the values of human dignity, charity, societal justice, compassion, and peace that are common to our multi-varied traditions and faiths, more than it does today. Out of our work, in such gatherings, one theme should resound. Humanity is not the prisoner of a bitter and unremitting past, but together we will be the shapers of a better and more hopeful future for all God's children. That is our common role. It is God's call to us, and it is our children's call to us as well, to be moral goads to the conscience of our people and our nations, bearers of flames of justice, weavers of dreams of freedom for all God's children. And we must never cease until we make real that world of justice and peace. Our tradition and history has called us to do that world of justice and peace our children so richly deserve. May that be the blessing of the work of our hands. May that be the blessing of our lives. And may gatherings such as this ennoble us in that task until we make it real.
So, first of all, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. And in this case, the first interfaith collaboration of the evening, per se, is going to be sharing the microphones at our table. So I look forward to collaborating with you on that. We're very fortunate to have a number of questions, in this case assembled by emerging religious leaders, emerging ethical leaders from across the country. And I wanted to give a special thanks, actually, to Ted Dedan, who is from Union Theological Seminary and really helped cull a lot of these questions and thoughts from his classmates and colleagues, really from across the religious and social spectrum. I'd like to begin with a question that Matt Hoffman posed. He's a student over at Union Theological Seminary, made the trip across the street, actually, and asked a question that is so present for our generation because we are growing up in the world's most religiously diverse society, arguably the most diverse society in religious terms since the fall of the Roman Empire. And the question is, how do we engage in social justice activism when at times we feel as though people of other religious traditions and their leaders may themselves not be heeding the call of social justice? How do we form interfaith coalitions when we're not always sure that we agree with our could-be partners? And so I don't know if there are any takers immediately, but I'd love to hear from each of you and your vision for that kind of interfaith collaboration.
I'll jump in, especially since I'm a union grad, and so go union. And I think the real challenge is finding the areas of commonality and also finding areas of relevance. Okay, so my first trip to Israel was an interreligious trip. For example, rabbinic students, seminary students, and it was to interrogate, explore, understand the conflict between Palestinians and Jews on the ground there. Everybody is not interested in learning that. You have to get people to a point where they're willing to be in dialogue one with another. But we're getting into a society, and I think both of you in different ways, but particularly you, Rabbi David, mentioned the technology issue. The technology in one way is driving us apart because we can silo our interests. We can self-select what it is we want to see, what we want to hear, whatever the issue is. It might even be Israel. It might be Muslim-Christian relations. It can be whatever it is, but you might not be getting the full spectrum of even the news on that. If you are not in dialogue broadly across platforms, across groups of people, across even outside of boundaries, geographic boundaries, you're not going to get the perspective. I'll give you an example just coming from this past electoral cycle. I went home to Iowa to work on the Obama campaign. I was stunned to see levels of voter suppression in Iowa that I would have expected from a freedom summer. Now, I haven't lived in Iowa since 1974 when I graduated from high school. The areas where they were doing the voter suppression did not exist really when I lived in Iowa. What do I mean by that? There were really no Mexican Americans in Des Moines when I left in 1974. After Kosovo, after the Serbo-Croatian War, after the Vietnam War, mass numbers of immigrant people came into Iowa. They did not live there when I lived there. However, there was all sorts of activity to make sure they didn't get to the Senior Citizen Center, to make sure that the polls changed, the times changed. They didn't have the kind of smartphones that all of us have in our bags and briefcases here. Okay, so how do you even get people aware of that if your level of social justice activism is only in the Bronx? Okay, or if only in New York, where pretty much everyone not only has a smartphone, they have an iPad, they have everything, okay? So it also does take a little bit of wherewithal as well as, meaning resources, capital, to leave your safe space and go to the places where there's yet work to be done. That's number one. Number two, leaving requires resources. There's never been a time, even though this is an extremely distinguished panel, there's never been a time that I have experienced where religious communities were so under siege from a financial standpoint. Lots of different ways, whether it's the congregants' inability to give the same levels that they once did, or whether it's the institution itself, which was reliant upon Wall Street returns to give certain levels of income to allow them to do the kinds of things that once were taken for granted. That does not exist. So we have to be more creative across a number of spectrums, from the technology side, from the giving side, from the speaking to one another side, and from the what does your social justice look like, okay? Because we're really quick to sort of box in what my social justice project is, which may or may not be the social justice project that the country needs addressing right now.
Yeah, just a sort of a variation on this theme is that very often, when we're so enthusiastic about what it is that we want to implement and do, we really think that we've got it right. And we get very frustrated by those people who just can't get what we have gotten. And they are a little bit different in their thinking, and maybe they're slowing us down. And maybe we should listen to them. Maybe we should talk to them. Maybe the best solution and the best path lies somewhere in between the two, and that maybe dialogue at that moment becomes very important. Now, if you feel there is no time to stop everything and talk, and I agree with you about that, there are things you could do, even if there are disagreements of sorts. Focus on the positive and dialogue on the differences. You can learn from the other just as the other would learn from you. Don't expect that whatever you want to do in a coalition, you will find people who will agree with you all the time. Just look for what is common.
It is true that the United States, rivaled only by India, is the most religiously diverse country in the history of the world. Sociologists tell us that there are 2,000 denominations, sects, faith groups in the United States. And it may well be true that 1,900 of them are in California, Nonetheless, this is an extraordinary country in terms of religious diversity. It's one of the reasons that many of us remain so committed to separation of church and state. It is precisely that wall that's kept government out of religion, that has allowed religion to flourish with a diversity and strength unmatched anywhere in the developed world today, rivaled again only by India, but far more people going regularly to worship, far more people believing in God, far more people holding religious values central to their lives than in any other democratic country or developed country, including everyone that has a government-sponsored, government-endorsed, government-supported, government-established religion. It's one of America's great birthrights. And one of the results is given religious minorities in this country more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities than many of us have known anywhere else in our history. So this is an extraordinary country. And the tradition of interfaith cooperation is long and deep, as I indicated here. But that's not to say there's unanimity. We all know the spectrum of religious views in this country. So first, dialogue is very important in terms of helping to increase understanding and overcome differences. But far more than dialogue is actual doing together. Here. It is when you work together cooperatively on the things you do agree with, that you build personal levels of trust and understanding that help you overcome moments when you disagree and potential strife is on the horizon. So it was very natural for the Catholic community and the mainline Protestant community and the Jewish community. It had a long history here, certainly from the time of the 60s onward, but it really had been working since the 30s onward together on many things. But after Vatican II, most particularly, it opened up. That not just through cooperation, but dialogue, study, openness to going to each other's services, the community Thanksgiving services, and all of that. But it left out large segments of America from the more fundamentalist communities and the new religious communities that were emerging here. And one of the ways you deal that is to be intentional about bringing people into coalitions that already exist, where you know they exist. So this applies to the Muslim community and the Asian religions, in the Native American religions, in terms of working on the traditional kind of generally progressive agenda of the mainline groups in this country. But it also involves finding common ground with the more fundamentalist elements. So I'm thinking of the efforts that many of us were engaged in by the late 90s through the Bush years that led to the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act and the creation of the U.S. Ambassador for Religious Freedom and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom that Aziz Al-Hebri serves on now. It resulted in the Sudan Peace Act that led to the appointment of John Danforth here to negotiate the treaty in the southern part of Sudan, and which now is broken off to be an independent under the agreements that he was able to negotiate. It led to many of the efforts to stand up against the genocidal activity in Darfur. It led to the passage of the prison rape bill. It led to the passage of the human trafficking bill that created the Human Trafficking Office at the State Department and Human Trafficking report. It led to the Jubilee, to them being involved in the more fundamentalist elements being involved in the Jubilee campaign. Some of them, and after a 10-year effort, brought many of them to begin to speak out about environmental concerns. It was a huge shift as evangelical theologians and megachurch pastors, the first in that community, began to talk out about the moral obligation to care about the poor and the moral obligation to care about protecting God's creation. We were able to find common ground. It is transforming the interaction between what are historically called the mainline traditions and the evangelical community. I think really bodes well for the future. Not going to be easy to get there. We still have differences. Religious intolerance from one religion to another, often driven by fundamentalists who believe only their view is right and all other views are wrong. Attitudes towards women, attitudes towards economic development. There are differences. We shouldn't make light of that fact or pretend that they are not there. And there are times where you're going to be competing for whose view is going to win. In the end, here I think the kind of view that has bound us together, and I think almost everyone in this room, I think in the end will prevail by the strength of its moral, compelling vision.
So first of all, thank you so much to all three of you. And speaking of California, Rabbi Saperstein, we have a question from Bhikshuni Lojang Trinley, who is a Buddhist nun getting an advanced degree at Claremont Lincoln University. And she talks about systematic issues of injustice, ingrained and entrenched injustice in our society. And the fact that, like many millennials, she feels as though we're focused so much on incremental change, we're not tackling some of the systematic, system-wide problems that we face. And whether it is worth kind of taking a leap of faith, if you will, and going for some of the big issues, or whether it's important to first start small, build the coalitions, and then move from there.
I think that is a very important observation. And many of us believe in American exceptionalism, and to that extent are very sensitive about any critique of systematic injustices that might then point to some imbalance in the basic structure. And I believe that this country, which is built on freedom of speech and freedom of thought, ought to be open if it wants to lead in the spiritual and ethical realm globally. It should be open to some of the most serious, harshest critiques of systematic imbalances and deficiencies, because only when we face ourselves without being defensive, but understanding that this is who we are open to criticism and we can do better. Only when we are willing to do that can we become a better nation.
I just want to echo Aziza's comments, but point out this falls for me into the, quote, daunting challenges that Rabbi Saperstein was talking about, because it implicates of the inability of our coalition partners to deal with the systemic imbalances within their own faith traditions, okay? So we still have, just sticking with Christianity for a moment, numerous subsets that have systemic issues about what is the role of women in pulpits. We still have long ways to go, well beyond what we've done at the Riverside Church, about having interracial congregations, okay? So where we've got other people, Riverside is founded on the notion not only of interdenominationalism, but internationalism and interracialism. You can look at one of the stained glass windows and see Muhammad in the stained glass. You can see Native Americans in the stained glass. You can see Martin Luther King and Erasmus in the chancel. There's a lot of stuff going on in Riverside if you want to just sort of figure out who is that up there, really. But we haven't taken that on, and that's a real problem I see, because part of the work we're doing at the Ministry of Education is trying to figure out how to engage younger people. It's wonderful to have congregations, historic congregations, but still, nevertheless, pews filled with people that are 65 years and above. We still have to, across religious traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, bring in a whole new generation. And questions like her implicate the question of, when are you guys going to bring the whole wagon train into the modern era as it relates to how you treat us in your congregations? And we don't have that answer yet. So that still is in the daunting challenges category.
I'm not sure that the difference between major structural change and smaller incremental change is that clear when you work it through. Where does major structural change come? It happens either with the use of force, think of revolutions that have changed here, or military intervention, World War II, in stopping Nazism, etc., or it happens by the culmination of huge amounts of incremental change that begin to coalesce at a certain time. Think of Gandhi in India. Think of Mandela in South Africa. Without a violent revolution, here, and think of the civil rights movement in this country. It started with a million different acts of resistance and opposition to it. We know the Rosa Parks. But what we don't know are the hundreds of thousands of people like your grandfather who spent time making a difference here in community after community after community where he was organizing just as he did in his own church in mobilizing people to do. And that was replayed thousands and thousands of times about it. It was all those cumulative things together that allowed us to begin to tear down the structure of Jim Crow and to separate but equal that had been imposed on the country both by informal force of power in white communities, as well as the Plessy v. Ferguson rulings of the court and the legislative authorities in those areas. It was undone by cumulative acts of incremental change. And think about, we have a capitalist system that has structurally creating huge aspects of injustice here. But to the extent that we've made changes in this country in terms of the economic system through the Great Society programs in Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and the food stamp program, that's the most facile and widespread of all the programs we have. There are millions and millions of people today who have opportunities they otherwise would not have had because we have a long way to go, and we haven't made the structural changes as great as we need to make them. But we've made some structural changes, and it's made America a fairer, more decent and compassionate place here. So, the difference between the incremental and the huge structural changes, sometimes the incremental doesn't get up to changing structures, and all it does is help the little people affected by the incremental things, and sometimes it does. It was Eisenhower, I think, who once talked about, in the pursuit of justice, that it would be, it would never happen until enough people stood up and insisted that their leaders stand aside until, like drops of water in the streams, it would become a torrent of a powerful stream that would sweep those leaders aside and bring us what we want. We never know when it just remains a little stream. If we did, we would solve all of these problems. It wouldn't be so daunting. We never know when the tactics and strategies we follow are going to lead to make real structural changes or just minor changes. But the truth is, every time we help even a single person, we're helping to make the world a better place.
I want to give you all a 5-minute warning. This conversation is going to end in 5 minutes, which means your part of the conversation is about to begin. If you need note cards, index cards to write your questions down, raise your hand and the ushers will bring you index cards. But during the next few minutes, write your questions down, and in now 4 minutes and 42 seconds, we will collect those cards and bring them to the panel.
So just a follow-up question to this conversation. We've spoken a lot about mobilization. We've spoken a lot about movements. We've spoken a lot about collaborative action that chips away at societal injustice. And all of a sudden, the millennial generation is a group of tech natives, people who have grown up with technology. We are so interconnected, so often on social media, on smartphones, on tablets, whatever it may be. What does mobilization, what does movement building look like in the age of the internet? I gave you guys an easy one.
Well, at dinner, I won't say who, said, what do we do to get these guys out marching? And I was thinking to myself, marching, not sure that's the way. I mean, Facebook, Twitter, there's all sorts of stuff that is really just a different language.
What's Facebook?
Yeah, I and so I think the challenge for us is bridging that divide, both those of us who went to big marches, and certainly there has been examples real time in the past 24 months of young people jumping in to a march-like context. Occupy Wall Street would be one example. Okay, so there are other cases of it. However, I think on the other side of that divide is the whole generation of those who marched in the 60s, who remember this and that, who need to now figure out how to cross that intergenerational demarcation and figure out, okay, how do you actually mobilize voters? How do you actually get people interested in a topic that's important to you? We just had at the church on Sunday a forum on fracking. It was all the marchers, okay? But it was none of the intergenerational folks. And in part, I believe that's because of how it was marketed, okay? We had in the worship bulletin, okay, printed, maybe something on our website, but maybe not on our website, okay? So the people who happen to be in the pews and hear there's going to be a Stop Fracking Now forum showed up. But that did not really touch the bulk of the Upper West Side community that might also want to know what is Governor Cuomo doing about the issue, okay? So, and much less cross interreligious lines. It didn't do that. And it could, because it's an issue that touches us all.
Yeah, I want to offer, a dissident voice on this one. I think that where there is palpable injustice that breeds frustration and despair and anger, the ability of social media to link people together and to mobilize them is really significant. I think in a country like the United States where there is enormous complacency, that social media and new media forms may actually exacerbate that complacency. And you indicated this before, drive people apart. In other words, it is one thing for you to be at an event here where we're looking at each other in the face and listening to each other and talking to each other. It is another thing when we do the same thing sitting in our room alone here on a device here. And yes, on one level we're connected, on the other level we are not connected. And what it also allows in the fragmentation of all of the different social media sites, the ability to like people and ignore other people, the ability on an infinite number of cable stations to listen to news that we agree with, whether that news is Fox News and MSNBC. Life becomes just an echo chamber for the views we already have. There's not much that really forces us to confront different views. So I don't know. I think that new technology in this case is neutral. And how we use it wisely and how we guide it and how we shape it is going to determine whether or not these are going to be powerful forces to lead to a better world. Or I go back to my big brother technology image here. It's going to be used as a way to make people more complacent and more divided than ever before. I think the jury's out on that. And this is one of the most pressing challenges that we face in this generation.
Yeah, I want to agree with you that the new technology has created a lot of opportunities and a lot of dangers. While it can connect a large number of people and mobilize them, it's also capable of manipulation, misinformation, or basically, as we just heard, to reinforce the views that you already have, and you're just going to look for them and nothing else. I mentioned this because, as you know, in certain parts of the world, Facebook and Twitter played a big role, and then they got manipulated and co-opted. So we have to be very careful. This is more anonymous than it would be if you're marching and you're face-to-face with the leaders and you can read their faces, feel their vibes, etc. At least it's a little bit more personal. But in this case, we are all now victims of. It used to be if it's in print, it must be true. Now, if it's on the internet, it must be true.
Yeah, and, just one other obvious point about this. When we were all watching somewhat centrist stations for our news source, or reading the major newspapers, they were able to ensure we'd hear differing viewpoints here. But that's broken down now in a way that is very counterproductive. David Frum talks about this study that was done in which they went and asked a set of questions put together by educators about current affairs in the United States and across the globe, and asked people by dint of what they matched up, what they knew about current events and across the globe, most basic kinds of things, and related it to what they read or watched. about it, and it wouldn't surprise you that the New York Times readers and NPR listeners were scored extraordinarily high on this. But then the more fragmented you got, even MSNBC folks and others, it was less and less. But Frum concludes his talking about it. I don't know if this is true, but I presume he wouldn't lie about it here, and said that the interesting thing about the Fox viewers was that they actually knew less about what was going on in the world than people who watch no news at all. So.
So now for your questions. Oh. In this room. So the first question, I think, is a really critical one. And in my mind, it kind of resonates with the statistic recently released by the Pew Forum that 30% of millennials do not affiliate with a religious tradition. And in this case, the question is, who is not in this room who needs to be?
No, I think it's only 30%, not 30% don't. Here.
Oh, only 30% who
only
do not.
yeah.
I do apologize.
Yeah.
Well, there's a whole huge community in the Upper West Side who's not in this room that needs to be in this room. And I think each of our faith traditions struggles with how to get them into worship services of any kind. And that goes back to what's relevant, what touches them. I mean, even in talking about marching and from the historic pulpit that we have just 2 blocks over, I still hear from young adults, yeah, but you're not talking about how the fact I've got massive student loan burdens, or how I can't find a job, or how I've got my 3rd graduate degree and that's still not equipping me for work. And these are justice issues. And that's sort of what I was talking about a moment ago, when it's what color is your rainbow and what does your social justice look like across certain categories. It's difficult to reach out. Thus, these vaunted organizations, whether it's the Riverside Church or whatever it is, are not drawing and attracting people even into the audiences and congregations such that they would be hearing these justice messages.
Let me, again, take a little bit of a divergent voice on this. This is a serious challenge for us. It clearly is. And it goes much beyond that. The vast majority of people now no longer belong to the denomination in which they were raised in. There is enormous spiritual questing, enormous willingness to move out of structures that people were raised in. People physically move more than they ever did here over their lifetimes. And again, the creation of community that's a lasting community, I think, is challenging when people are moving so much. And again, social media can be a way of reaching those people, bringing them into community, and it can be a way of feeling they don't need community because they have the community online that they used to have only in person. So a very complex number of factors. But here's my one divergent view from the common wisdom about what a catastrophe is. I read the Pew stuff very carefully, and I'm chairman of a board of a nonprofit that runs with Pew and Gallup, one of the 3 major polling things in this, called Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, Robbie Jones's work, et cetera. So I've looked at this carefully, and I don't think the right questions have been asked yet in this cohort. Because the truth is, if you define young adult as somebody between high school and having children, I don't think we ever have more than that. Certainly not in the mainline Protestant groups and Reform Conservative, in the more fundamentalist components of the religious community. You have much more engagement for people in their young adulthood. But we never had it. For 3 generations, we haven't had those people. What's different today is rather than getting married and start having children by their late 20s, they're getting married and not having children by their late 30s. So we have a gap of 20 years. None of those polls ask the question, when you have children, do you anticipate going back to and I really think until we know that answer, whether we're seeing a seismic shift or this is a reflection of a change in this generation in terms of demographic patterns about when they get married or don't get married at all and have a family here, it doesn't allow us to really create a strategy to be most effective in trying to reach them here. And I think we have to know more about what that is. But here, the other thing just to say about those unaffiliated is, in other words, as a snapshot, right now, 1/3 of Americans say they're unaffiliated. It's higher than ever before in our history here. But the majority of them are religious. Only 10% of Americans consider themselves atheists or secularists, not interested in religion. A lot of them are religious. A lot of them go from one religious group to another religious group. Some are just define themselves as spiritual questers here. But don't think of this as an anti-religious thing. It's a change in religion in America, and trying to figure out how we, in the structural institutions, the houses of worship and the denominations and the other how we engage with them differently is a central challenge that we face. But for all of these reasons, I'm not quite as pessimistic about some of this data yet as some of the folks who walked away with the impression that we've lost a majority of people who are members, of the younger generation who are no longer members of the church, and the growing number of people who are secular, who are unaffiliated because they're just lost forever. I really don't think that's the case.
I think the study for Muslims might have an additional twist. If you talk to teenagers in high school, in schools, or to young people who are either married or not married, many of them have been victims of bullying, have been victims of various other aspects of discrimination. And so we find a trend where they do not want to declare publicly that they are people of faith or Muslim. And that might distort some of the results.
Wow. So first of all, fascinating in terms of the statistics themselves. What do they show and what do they not show? So the Pew statistic that 1/3 of millennials do not affiliate with a particular religious tradition. There's a question here that says that overall 20% of the U.S. population now fits in this none category. I don't know where the statistic is from, so hard to verify.
It's also Pew.
It's also Pew?
The nuns.
Well, the nuns, but in terms of the 20%. But let's work with 20% for now. So we have 1/5 of the population going with this number that does not affiliate with a particular religious denomination. How do those people fit into multi-religious coalitions about social justice issues that matter to us all?
I've already given you my take on those folks. I would simply add that many of them, who I said are kind of feel amorphously religious or maybe moving from one thing to another, many of the people actually find religious identity and expression through social justice work. So take the Jewish community. The studies since the mid-1980s show that if you ask American Jews, what is the primary, and listen carefully, the primary, not the only, most people express their religious identities in many different ways, but what's the primary way that you express your Jewish identity? By margins of 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 over things like Jewish study or Jewish worship or support for Israel. American Jews say the primary way they express their Jewish values or identity is through tikkun olam, through social justice work or a commitment to social idealism, depending on how the question is phrased here. This can be an important conduit to bring people back into Jewish life. People believe they're playing out their religious values, and often will be part of more informal or a non-church or synagogue-based religious activity in communities. Look at all of the urban-centered Jewish social justice independent entities that have sprung up all across the country and attracted so many young people in the last generation in American Jewish life. The question for us is, how do we use that as a gateway to reach them where they are and bring them back more into organized life?
The other thing I'd like to add is that I think that there is some hope on the international front in ways that are perhaps even more challenging domestically, insofar as there are initiatives where people do want to work for clean water, work for housing and take themselves out of the traditional environment, although Habitat for Humanity domestically would be another example of sort of a social justice work that does draw large numbers of people right here domestically. But I think that there is a hope that we can see certain initiatives, whether it be in South Africa or elsewhere, moving people into activism. I think that I have to just endorse what Rabbi Saperstein just mentioned, though. How do you then turn that energy back into these institutionalized organizations where there's considerable skepticism in this age cohort?
I agree with what was said.
So what is the most pressing social justice issue of our day?
Domestically or internationally?
Feel free to pick two.
Well, I'm going to jump in here as it's not the most pressing, but again, I guess I'm going to raise it up because we've had action just in the past week of the United States Senate passing the Violence Against Women Act, which did not make it through last time for a lot of different ridiculous reasons. 1 in 4 women around the world face this problem. I'm raising it up because we've got a lot of social justice issues that people don't want to talk about, and this is one of them. So if we can't get agreement on some of the things that sweep across borders, across country lines, across religious traditions. In New York, we've had this particular issue, violence against women, embarrass Christian groups, embarrass the Jewish community, and reach into the Muslim community. And we can't even get across interreligious coalitions to talk about it. That's going to be, for me, what I raise my hand and say that's an important issue. We got 50% of the people who are women in this country, and we need to at least go back to the basics and figure out how we can start talking about equality across gender lines and then taking it the next level, eliminating what I consider to be a scourge on our society, which is violence against 50% of the people who are living on this planet.
Let me follow up on what you say. And my organization does a lot on domestic violence issues. And one of them is to educate the people how spiritually this is not acceptable.
Right.
But I would say that the most pressing issue today in the world is the fact that if we look at ourselves carefully, we'll find out that many of us do not really believe that all people are equal and are entitled to dignity, equal dignity as ours. And it's only when we really believe it at the depth of our hearts that the conflicts in this world will disappear, whether male or female. And I am really concerned about the future of this universe, this world. We've been fighting this fight forever. And our religions have always taught, at least in Islam, I know God says we've given dignity to the children of Adam, all the children of Adam, male, female, black, white, brown, Muslim, non-Muslim. Do we understand that? Do we live by it? And other religions have similar principles. And yet, for some reason, entrenched in us is the view that somehow we're better than somebody. That destructive hierarchical view of the world needs to change. And yes, it will be changed incrementally, as Rabbi Saperstein had mentioned. Already gone some of the distance in the U.S. and other distances around the world, but I see this as the biggest challenge that will stay with us, and we will fight it for some time to come.
It's a fascinating question when you ask which is the most pressing. So I'm struck by your comment about violence against women. I think if you ask me which question are religions a huge obstacle to dealing with, it's the question of equality for women. And I think without equality for women, we're never going to make our way out of countless other problems that we face in the globe. We're not going to make our way out of the population problem. We're not going to make our way out of the economic justice problem. Not going to make our way out of education of children here. We're not going to make our way out of health problems here. I think this is vital. And I can't think of any issue in which segments of the religious community, large segments, are as much of an obstacle to making achievement as they are in helping on this. But if I had to go, with the others, I think the two that I mentioned, simply because they involve survival, global warming and non-conventional weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. We don't solve those two problems, we're not going to make it. The one thing I'm sure of, there will be no Noah's Ark here if we so alter the climate of the globe that the seas rise and the climate is degraded. There's going to be Noah's Ark that's going to protect us who are here tonight, or anyone else on Earth here. This is an extraordinary challenge, and if we blow up the world in a nuclear holocaust, so on one level, that's the other pressing. I think the greatest intuitively moral issue for us is what happens to the poor. We cannot live with the global inequities where the United States consuming daily 20% of the calories and 20% of the energy of the entire world consumed at the same way we consume. There wouldn't be anything for 80% of the world. We can't go on this way. We have to change this here. And, we live in a world where the have-nots know increasingly, because of new technologies, exactly what the haves have. And I'm saying, whoa, you kidding? This isn't right. This isn't fair. Why can't my children have the same opportunities your children have? And there's no answer to that other than we have to make sure that they have the same opportunities. And I just think in terms of the religious community's historic vision of the fundamental dignity of every human being created in the image of God and the fundamental right of every human being to fulfill his or her own potential, that this remains the great moral issue facing humanity.
I want to close with a word of Torah, if you will, that is apropos what David said about Noah's Ark. There is no Noah's Ark. My teacher, Mustafa Serich, who was the Grand Mufti of Sarajevo, who lived through the siege of Sarajevo, he likes to invoke Noah's Ark. And his message is very clear. We're all in the same boat together. So with that, I want to thank really an extraordinary panel, not only for your comments, but for your leadership day in, day out. Thank you very much. I want to thank Zahida Mohammed and the Mandela Center for bringing this idea to JTS, and my sisters and brothers, Aziz Al-Hebri, Julie Johnson-Staples, David Saperstein, and I guess my baby brother, Josh Stanton.